All right, so we can move to the next talk, Greg Witkowski.
Thank you, and yeah, just thanks to those presenters for what they've done. It's sort of a perfect example of philanthropic engagement that's ongoing. I'm an instructor of philanthropy and teaching a course on disaster philanthropy in the nonprofit management program. I'm a historian by training, so I tend to look at things with a bit of more perspective than I'm allowed to with COVID-19. But my current book is actually on nonprofit response to 9/11, and I'm seeing comparisons to COVID-19 and 9/11, as well as in some ways COVID-19, its social effects are a combination of the effects of 9/11 plus the Great Recession, as many people are defining it. And so I've been tracking this as sort of in real time with an effort to write some op-eds, as well as an ultimate effort to publish in a more scholarly fashion on this topic. So I want to present some, first attempts at looking at that and setting things here in context for understanding this disaster giving. So there are really three buckets that we get for philanthropic giving for disasters: corporate giving, foundation giving, and individual household giving. Corporate and foundation giving tend to be the fastest delivered because of the fact that fewer people are deciding. They know exactly where they're going to give. They have established relationships. Individual giving tends to lag a little bit, but the vast majority of giving for disasters is done in the first month or so. What's interesting about this one, and I'll compare this to some other disasters, we don't really know how long it's going to go. So we'll see how that plays out. Nonprofit organizations are dependent upon this. Nonprofits account for about 10% of the US workforce, and about 11% of their budget is from philanthropy. The rest comes from fees for services or government grants and the like. So this is just kind of a basic outline of what we'll be what I'll be talking about and what to look at. So COVID-19 compared to other major disasters. Well, first off, the majority of major disasters we've studied are natural disasters that are geographically limited, even when they're limited to a city like Hurricane Katrina or a region like Hurricane Florence. There's still some geographic limitation. Here we see that this is throughout the US and even global. And so we don't have that kind of situation in which people from an unaffected area can help those who are affected. We don't see real physical destruction of infrastructure, which is something that is also different compared to most other disasters. And it's an ongoing one, which is a bit different than most other disasters. And so, as I say, those differences may have an impact on some otherwise normal trends. There are a great deal of similarities, and some of these are getting a whole lot more attention with this disaster because there is far less going on in the public sphere. The media is focused on this. A lot of people are focused on this. And so, for instance, there's a tendency to think that disasters affect all equally, but the harm has never really been distributed equally. So those socioeconomic class matters a lot, ethnicity matters a lot, and we're seeing that especially in the reporting surrounding COVID-19 here. But this is a trend that is maybe exacerbated by the fact that a pandemic builds on long-term distinctions, but really is part of almost every major disaster in the US. The harm goes far beyond the actual cause. So we think of economic effects, but some of the less understood ones usually are the social effects. So there's always an increase in domestic violence after major disasters. What we're seeing now, again, it's exacerbated by the fact that people are staying in homes and sort of forced in difficult situations. And so, again, also getting reported in a way that it may not have for other disasters. Finally, all major disasters have a far longer tail than we recognize. So it takes years to recover from major disasters, and could be a decade in this one. Far after attention has moved on to other things, whether it be further natural disasters that come along or whether it be just other things in life. So those are kind of some context to how this disaster can be seen. A study run by the Center on Disaster Philanthropy about why households gave would tend to indicate that we're we should be looking at a great deal of giving for COVID-19. The scale of a disaster was a huge impact. There was a personal connection to it, whether or not they knew anyone, media coverage. These are all large factors inspiring people to give. And so we would think and expect a large philanthropic response. There are some mitigating factors. That same study shows those who chose not to give. A number of the reasons that they cited was really mostly related to financial, and certainly the way COVID-19 has been impacting the economy, we could expect some countervailing trends there. So what's happened so far? Well, in terms of foundation and corporate giving, we've seen a far greater emphasis and focus on this. So corporate giving, the U.S. Chamber measures those corporations that do pledge support. And to date, by the way, we've mostly seen pledges, not actual distributions, which is not uncommon at this point. But up to now, about 400 organizations, corporations have pledged support. By comparison, Hurricane Florence, throughout the entire hurricane and recovery, 120 corporations pledged support. Foundation giving globally, we see 7.8 billion pledged, and that's a huge amount for disaster, far beyond what is normally pledged. The Gates Foundation alone has pledged up to $250 million to fund responses. Some of the things that they were funding, a research accelerator, you can see Gates, Wellcome, and MasterCard were involved with that. Locally, Robinhood reactivated their relief fund, which provides for basic needs in New York. The New York Community Trust created a large sort of collaborative COVID-19 fund. And in Seattle, which is one of the first places that the disease hit, the Seattle Foundation, which is a local community foundation, created what they called a collaborative table, bringing corporations, government officials, and nonprofits together to sort of figure out how to best respond to this disaster. One of the things that's a little bit beyond philanthropy, but is significant in this, generally FEMA takes the lead, and generally we see the federal government really providing guidance and leadership, which we've seen far less of in this disaster. So here we see a case with the Seattle Foundation of them stepping in that place. So as you can see, for a normal year, this is foundation giving for all sorts of disasters. So all the disasters within that year, as well as disaster kind of mitigation and resilience. So in a normal year, foundations give about, in the US, about 55 million to disaster relief and response, and another, say, 25 million or so to reconstruction and recovery. So even the Gates Foundation in and of itself has surpassed the normal year giving related to this. So the scale of this is immense. So what about individual and household giving? As I said, that tends to lag a little bit as these relief funds are created, and we do see a number of large initiatives this weekend. The One World at Home Together concert raised approximately 200 million, about 128 for the World Health Organization Solidarity Fund, and another 73 that went to local relief organizations. The New Jersey Community Foundation, together with the Governor's Office in New Jersey, created a pandemic relief fund that to date has already raised 21 million, and tonight they too are hosting a conference, Jersey for Jersey. They're expecting to bring in a good deal of additional funds. And then donor advised funds. Donor advised funds are funds that people put into essentially a philanthropic checking account. They deposit it 1 year, but they don't need to distribute it in that year. And so for many people, it increases in the amount of money that's there. There are no payout requirements year over year, but what some of the donor advised fund managers have begun to see is individuals are seeing this as an opportunity to use their funds wisely that are already in a donor advised fund. And so there's reporting of larger payouts. Finally, there's some broader trends that we're seeing. So foundations are actually required to grant 5% of their endowment assets. And there's a number of nonprofit network leaders that have called for foundations to grant more than that 5%. And we have seen some foundations embrace that trend. Another thing that foundations have done, and they wound up supporting numerous nonprofits with their grants, is they simplified both the application requirement and the reporting requirement, allowing nonprofits a lot more flexibility in how they use the funds that's granted to them. This is something that nonprofits have been calling for years, but foundations have been reluctant to do. The field has had advocacy success as well. So the stimulus bill, the CARES Act, the first one that was passed had a $300 above line deduction. So if you take a standard deduction and for your taxes, you can also take up to $300 cash deduction for donating to a nonprofit. And that, I think, is an important way to inspire people to give more. And nonprofits are eligible for those same small business loans that that ran out but are now apparently being renewed. And so I think they've had some of the same struggles that other actual small businesses have had in terms of competing with larger chains, but nonetheless, they are eligible for those loans. So some things to think about moving forward are, there's always the question of, our pledges followed? Do corporations, especially who will be facing a good deal of economic struggle to maintain their liquidity, will they be able to continue to follow up on their pledge? We've seen pretty clearly an increase in giving, and there was also an increase in giving and voluntarism following 9/11. That was a blip that went up and then returned down. We'll see if that continues to remain high. Will it remain high for foundations as well? Will they continue to grant above that 5% and continue to keep their reporting requirements low? There's a question as well of long-term need. So we've been really in a situation where everyone is scrambling to provide for immediate needs. How are philanthropists, how are nonprofits going to address long-term need when they clearly will continue to be in a budget crunch? Will there be a rise in horizontal giving? So people helping each other out, a kind of mutual aid. And a lot of that runs through organizations that really aren't nonprofits. Things like GoFundMe and other kind of crowdsourcing platforms are how people have tended to get that aid. So will we see a kind of rise in that? And will there be scandals involved with that so that people begin to think, okay, maybe this is not how I want to grant my money, whether it's that's directed straight towards those crowdsourcing platforms, or is it directed towards philanthropic giving more broadly? So I think those are a couple of the sort of key questions moving forward. One of the recent studies that was run, and I didn't have it, it was popped in my inbox about an hour ago, so I didn't have a chance to put this slide up, is how young people are approaching this pandemic and what they're seeing as ways that they can have a public good. And many of them are focusing on things like buying from local organizations, the donating that they're doing. They are pushing towards healthcare reform. So we might see a different kind of approach of what is defined as means of bringing about social good, as well as what causes people support. So those, I think, are all kind of underlying issues to consider. I'd be really interested, one of the things that I find helpful in terms of thinking about this is to hear from those of you, especially on the medical side, if you've had positive or negative experiences with philanthropy. This is something that, again, will be ongoing for me as a research project.
Thank you, Greg. Very interesting. We have a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody would like to ask a question to Greg, please raise your hands. Margaret, you're on.
Hello, Greg. I'm also a historian. So I have a question for you in terms of language and messaging. The idea of disaster or disaster relief really is something that has implied, yes, it's a hurricane. We can throw money at the problem and it'll resolve, and this idea of resilience and so on. But it seems to me that COVID-19 is really something different. It's not a disaster in the usual way that we think of disaster or disaster relief. I mean, this is something that's rather more cataclysmic. It's not a virus that's sort of going around that we're going to be able to quickly get rid of, but something that in fact is staying around. And how does that then change the dynamics as we think about nonprofit response? I mean, yes, people will sort of give money very quickly to solve a problem, but what if the problem is not solving quickly? And should we think about this differently, perhaps, or come up with language that is something other than disaster, so that we can message to people that this is just not going to go away right away?
I appreciate that, Margaret. I think, so just to your question about, the first question about how different is this, again, it's a similar pattern. So people may throw money at an issue, but they don't throw enough money ever. And so what we wind up having in disaster relief and recovery is that their needs are never really recovered. And I will say, I've never seen a study on this, but anecdotally, about 6 months later, people stop saying your loss is a result of your disaster and start saying that your loss is a result of self-defined choices, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't think, I get your point, but I think it's a matter of scale versus a completely different issue.